Jorge is the clinical director for Mending Clinic and their Restore Advanced Outpatient Program in Arlington, Texas. He started his mental health career on the MCOT team for MHMR Tarrant County and has been in private practice for more than 10 years. He graduated with honors from Texas Wesleyan University and is published in Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition. You can find him at mendingclinic.com. Without further ado, here is Jorge.
Thank you, Gina. I appreciate that. Okay, let me get this started. Well, first off, I want to thank everybody that's here today. I know that secondary trauma is something, especially in our practices and day to day with COVID and with okay. All right, looks like my screen is shared. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for coming today, for showing up. This is great. I appreciate you being here. Secondary trauma, I think now is, we're seeing it more than before when we look at COVID, when we look at some of the social issues going on, the way that we process that, the way that we understand it creates a shift in the way that we look at our life, and that even if we're not directly in that moment of when something traumatic happens, but hearing from it over and over, or from seeing it on social media, or seeing it in emails, or seeing it on the news, it can create secondary trauma. Okay, so I'm going to start off first with talking about vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma occurs from repeated exposures to other people's trauma. So on the surface, you look at it and you go, well, it's the same thing, you know, as secondary trauma. And as we get into it, you'll see that they're different. So it's the emotional residue of exposure that counselors have from working with people as they are hearing their trauma stories and become witness to the pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. And so the word that I really want you to look at is a residue, right? So there's a residue. There's something that's there that possibly something else gets put on top of it, and it creates this film, or it creates a residue or a filter from what we're looking at. So compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a type of indirect trauma specific to healthcare professionals caused by the emotional residue, there's that word again, residue, of working with those who have experienced trauma. It may cause emotional exhaustion and a lack of empathy towards clients. So if we look at what is secondary trauma, so secondary traumatic stress is the development of PTSD-like symptoms without directly witnessing or having been involved in a traumatic event. So these are post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'll get into it in just a sec with the criteria for it, because I think it's important that we understand and realize when we're working with somebody that has post-traumatic stress disorder, what it takes to actually get that diagnosis. It isn't an easy diagnosis to get. We don't want anybody to have it. However, there's a lot of detail and intricacies that create that diagnosis. So vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. So when we look at those two side by side, on the surface, they look the same. And you go, oh, well, vicarious trauma, you know, you can see it, it's in the word, it happens, you're not there, but trauma is kind of the same thing. But it's in secondary trauma because vicarious trauma happens over time. And so there's a buildup inside, you feel it, and you're fighting against it, you're trying to manage it. What secondary trauma is, and I use this in the podcast, is talking about your cell phone. So your cell phone has a limited amount of storage. When that storage is full, you'll start noticing that your apps start closing, or they don't start working as efficiently as they did. Maybe the text message, you don't have the ability to to be on the internet because it won't work. And so everything starts closing and it doesn't function the way that it's supposed to. And that's what we look at with secondary trauma, is there's an immediate onset. It doesn't happen over time. It does, but we feel it when it happens immediately. So let's get into post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, so what is post-traumatic stress disorder? Post-traumatic stress disorder is when somebody has been through a situation where they have threatened or actual death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So this person was there, it happened to them, or they were in that situation when it happened. They witnessed it firsthand. So that's when we look at post-traumatic stress disorder. And it could be a family member, it could be a close friend, it could be somebody that they know, but really and truly, it doesn't have to be somebody that you're connected to. It just has to be something that creates just this distress, emotional distress inside of you. And that's what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay. So when we look at diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder, so we have to look at the presence of one or more of the following intrusion symptoms associated with traumatic events, beginning after the traumatic event occurred. So that's important, beginning after the traumatic event or events occurred. So before that, there wasn't these symptoms. And so like recurring and involuntary and intrusive distressing memories of the traumatic events, recurring distressing dreams in which the content and or affect of the dream are related to traumatic events. So that's one of the things that I think is important when I'm working with clients and they're telling me, man, I'm having these dreams. Sometimes they have really nothing to do with the actual trauma, but it's something associated with them thinking they're going to die, or them running away from something or someone, or them feeling like they're being attacked. So there's a constant theme there. And I typically will ask them, did this start after the event, or did it start, was there before the event? Because if it was before the event, then there's a possibility that there's other traumas that have happened, or it could just be that's how they dream. So dissociative reaction, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the traumatic event were recurring. So in children, trauma-specific reenactment may occur in play. So in play is where you see a kid maybe hitting a doll, or you see a kid inappropriately having two dolls together, or just in the situations that they're in, maybe with a knife or a gun, you see them replay that. But here's one of the things that I would encourage you to think about: the dissociative reactions. So when somebody is disassociating, the act of doing something helps you not feel whatever is being triggered. And so when people disassociate and they run or they shut down, in that process of shutting down, or in that process of running from whatever the distress is, they're not feeling the actual distress in itself. So that's important to remember. Intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. So I worked with people that have come back from war, and one of the things that I realized is we have to be very aware of every single movement that we do. I was with a client one time and we were talking, and I had my pen and I was clicking my pen. I didn't realize I did this, but I was clicking my pen, and my client's face just turned completely pale white, and he's looking at me, and his face is getting noticeably upset and noticeably angry. So when I asked him, I said, hey, what's going on? Like, we were having a conversation, everything was going great, and then all of a sudden, there's been a dramatic change in your affect. And he said, you know what? When I was at war, he said, they used phones, little track phones, to deploy or to have the bombs go off. He says, so when you do the clicking, to me, it sounds like the phones that they used to use back at war to have the bombs go off. And so we have to be aware of that. So I had to stop, move, put the pen over, not use it anymore, because that was triggering my client. So marked physiological reactions to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic events. And so that happens. There's a book called The Body Keeps a Score. And in that book, part of what they talk about is the traumas are stored in our cells. And so even though we may not cognitively pick up or subconsciously pick up on some of the things that are going on, our body, our cells will know this is not right. Like, this is not okay. This is bringing up a lot of emotions or a lot of feelings from something that happened in the past. Persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event occurred, as evidenced by one or both of the following. So avoidance of efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings or closely associated with the traumatic event. So anything that resembles the traumatic event, and that could be a room, it could be the way something is expressed, it could be just a number of things can really trigger those emotions. So avoidance of or efforts to avoid external reminders, people, places, conversations, activities, objects, situations that arose distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about it closely associated with traumatic events. This one, I have worked with clients that hate going to the hospital. And as I'm working with them, I always want to know if something happened in the hospital. And most of them had said, I don't remember, unless there was something that specifically happened. And they're like, yes, this is what happened, and this is why I don't want to go back. But interestingly enough, I've had some clients that have talked to me and said, I don't know what happened. You know, I don't really go to the hospital. I'm pretty healthy. And what I'll tell them is, okay, I want you to go back and I want you to talk to your mom or your dad and find out about the birth. Tell me about that. How was it? Was it seamless? Was it difficult? Was it traumatic? What's going on? And what I have found is that clients will come back and say, you know, my mom, you know, it was life or death for her, or, you know, it was very difficult. It was a very long birthing process, or they'll come back and say, yes, it was an emergency and we had to do it, you know, an emergency C-section. And those are things that they don't remember. They didn't witness it, but their cells did and their body does remember. And so they avoid going to the hospital at all costs. And so when you look at that, you ask yourself, so is that really you're not a sickly person, or do you just not go get help when you need help? So D, negative alterations in cognition and mood associated with the traumatic events, beginning or worsening after the traumatic events occurred, as evidenced by two or more of the following. Inability to remember important aspects of the event, not due to amnesia. So what we're looking at, if they're having a hard time, if their memory's fragmented, if it doesn't flow and there's no medical reason for it, and there is a traumatic event, then we know that that could be part of the reason, is because they have an ability to remember it. So persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs. I'm bad, no one can be trusted, the world is dangerous. And this is one that oftentimes clients don't understand that they're doing. They just know that it doesn't feel safe, and they just know that they don't want to do whatever that is. And once you get digging into it and you look at the core, I have found that my clients will say, well, it's really unsafe to trust somebody, or it's really unsafe to put myself in that kind of predicament, because it starts creating this fear, this distress of things that have happened in the past. And sometimes they don't even realize that that's what's driving it. Persistent negative or distorted cognitions, blaming self or others. And so this is where we look oftentimes where people that struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder kind of see themselves as a victim. They place blame on everybody around them, and they see themselves as the victim. And so when you look at that, you can look at it as two ways. You can look at it as, okay, so this person is a victim and they're gonna, you know, wallow in their victimhood, or they need empowerment. And if we can look at them from a place of they need empowerment, let's help them be empowered for themselves, as opposed to empowering, you know, to get them to meet our agenda as clinicians. Then that makes it powerful, because it makes it their walk, not ours. Persistent negative emotional state, fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame. These are all protective measures. And so their body is saying, no, we're not going to do that because it's dangerous. And so anger, one of the things that I have seen with anger, with post-traumatic stress disorder, is it's typically not just anger. There's some level of anxiety that's underlying that actually stimulates the anger. So as a defensive mechanism, so they feel like they're in survival mode. Markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So if somebody historically has wanted or has worked out, has gone to the gym and taken care of themselves, has eaten healthy, and then there's a traumatic event and they stop going to the gym, or they go 3 times a week as opposed to 5 times a week, that is something to look into. Is there a lack of motivation? Is it just a busy schedule? What's going on? And really getting to the root of that is what's important. Feeling of detachment or estrangement of others. So this is one, when we look at spouses, when we look at a marriage where somebody has had trauma in their past, it's very difficult to emotionally connect with that for them, because they feel as unsafe. It's vulnerable. It's vulnerability, and people that struggle with PTSD, they don't want to be vulnerable. Persistent inability to experience positive emotions, inability to experience happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. So this is one that I find very fascinating, and here's why. So some of the people that I've worked with that have trauma, they're always waiting for the next shoe to drop. So it makes them hyper vigilant, it makes them hyper aware. Even when things are going good in their life, they're not able to enjoy them because their brain has now been rewired to not feel like there's going to be prolonged goodness or happiness in their life. Something is going to go wrong. So we're going to do a case study real quick. And after this case study, we're going to switch gears for a little bit. So this was a client that I worked with, and I changed the name and I changed the age just to be able to protect the identity. And I do have permission to use this story. So this client, Bertha, she came to our office, and as we're talking to her, we found out that her first sexual abuse happened when she was 6 years old, and it was by a neighbor friend. They used to play, had a fun time. Mom trusted, the parents. Mom trusted the boy. They were in his room at one point. He started touching her in inappropriate ways. She didn't realize what was going on. She thought it was a game, so she didn't think anything about it. She felt like it was wrong. She felt like she felt like something wasn't right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. So when she was 12, she was in a situation with an older boy. I think the boy was about 15 or 16, and he wanted to play the kissing game. And so she wasn't sure what that was, and she didn't know how it played or how that ended up working. But he started kissing her, and that was the first actual rape that happened. So the first sexual abuse was at 6 years old. The second, where there was actual penetration, was at 12 years old, and this was by an older boy. The third sexual abuse happened when she was 17 years old, and this was by an ex-boyfriend. And he used it, if you love me, then you would do this. And he was very controlling, and he was very possessive, and he would tell her, well, because you're my girlfriend, you have to do these things. This is what girlfriends do. And so she was forced to engage sexually, and that happened over several years. When she was in her mid-20s, she was at a party, and she had drank too much, possibly drugged, and she woke up the next day, and she was in a room, and there was people around her, and she had been sexually abused, and she could tell she had been sexually abused, so she had to go to the hospital and get checked. The fifth sexual abuse, and this is the one that actually brought her into our office. So before we get into this fifth sexual abuse, part of the reason why I wanted to provide this background is because when we're seeing clients, or when we're seeing young kids that are coming out of a very difficult situation, this isn't their first trauma, or this isn't the first impacting thing that has happened to them. There is a whole story and a whole history behind them. And trauma doesn't necessarily have to be an abuse. Trauma could be the way that the kid or the adult interprets it, because the brain will interpret that trauma as trauma. So the fifth sexual abuse happened when she was 32 years old. She had some friends over to the house, and they were having some drinks and just hanging out. And the friends ended up leaving. Well, one of the friends stayed behind, and they were talking and they were having good conversation. Well, he ended up actually drugging her and tied her up and sexually abused her for hours and hours and hours. And then the following morning left her tied up bondage. She couldn't get out. And it wasn't until one of her friends 2 days later came to her apartment because they couldn't find her. They didn't know where she was. They would call her, she wouldn't answer, she wouldn't respond, she couldn't. And so her friend came to the house and finally got her loose. Well, when she was loose in those 2 days, there was no food, there was no hydration, there was she felt like she was gonna die. So after that situation, she had some severe PTSD with disassociation, not being able to trust people, not being able to connect with people. So when we think about these stories of the clients that we're listening to, I want you to remember that you can't unhear anything that you've heard, and you can't unsee anything that you've unseen. And so it's really important that we keep in mind. It says audio is low. Turn it up. Okay, so we just have to keep in mind that in order for us to be able to work with other clients, that there is, or work with that client, that there's baggage, that there's stuff in the background. And so we have to be very careful of the words that we use. We have to be very careful of how we are working with these clients. And so one of the things that I always talk to clinicians is you have to be careful with using the word safe, because safe doesn't always mean safe for the people that are coming to see us. Safe is distorted when somebody has post-traumatic stress disorder and they have an event, an event of demarcation, then we know that that word safe is completely distorted for them. They don't see safe as the way as healthy or untraumatized people see safe. Their brain processes it completely different. We're going to switch gears for a quick sec. We're going to go into burnout, because when I hear clinicians that I've counseled, or when I've heard psychiatrists that I have relationships with, there is this level of kind of feeling like they're expressing that they're burnt out, but really in talking to them and getting the actual symptoms and hearing what's going on and what's happening, it's actually that they have secondary traumatic stress. It isn't just being burnt out. So I want to make sure that I differentiate those here today. So burnout is an exhaustion, is a chronic state of physical and emotional depletion that results from excessive job and or personal demands and continuous stress. So when we look at burnout and we look at secondary trauma, it's important to differentiate. So it says depletion that results from excessive job and or personal demands and continuous stress. So burnout isn't hearing stories, it isn't reading files, It isn't hearing these traumatic situations. It's more the institution that you're working for is putting a lot of pressure on you. So it creates this level of burnout. It describes a feeling of emotionally extended and exhausted by one's work. So when we look at secondary trauma, we're looking at there's an exhaustion from the traumatic stories that we've been hearing. So what is burnout? So it generally happens over time, and it's a buildup, a change such as time off a new or different job can take care of the burnout or improve it. So that's one of the big differences. So when we look at burnout, typically if you can have a change in whatever your position is, or if you have a change to a different job, now we're looking at there's some sense of relief or it improves it. When you're looking at secondary trauma, if you change jobs or you change positions, though that trauma follows you, it continues. It doesn't stop when you leave that position. So there are two very different distinctions there. So burnout in action, so there's excessive blaming, apathy, sad, no longer finds activities pleasurable, chronic fatigue, isolation from others, loss of appetite, bottled up emotions, anxiety and depression, voices excessive complaints about administrative duties, poor self-care and addictions. And this is one where if you look at it, you can say, oh, well, all of us have that, or all of us have been that, that way at some point, which is true. I think we all get stressed. We all get to a point where we feel overwhelmed, or there's too much on our plate. But the difference is how it impacts your life. And it's also a personality. So I think some of us either have more grit or have been able to better deal with these situations where burnout may come and go, or it may come and you have some self-awareness, so you do something to take care of it and you're able to move forward. Or other times I think it builds up and we just kind of stuff all the emotions and we end up moving to a different position. So before we get started on this video, I want everybody to go ahead and unmute themselves. Now I'm gonna move this over. I want to see if I can see some faces. So I want to hear, when you hear the name Bertha, the case study that we were talking about just a little while ago, or as I was telling you about it, tell me what you were feeling or what was going through your mind. I want to hear some words or some phrasing. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. So if you guys want to answer that question, unmute yourself and answer with your opinion on your thoughts and feelings when he was going through that scenario.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So, I heard that, and it's really, it's very overwhelming to think of that happening in so many different ways from so many different people to one individual. And some of it so violently, especially the fifth example of what happened to her. Just imagining the fear that she must have been in when she realized her situation. As soon as you start imagining that fear, you do feel it yourself.
Yeah. If you kind of think back at it, what did you feel in your body?
I wasn't paying attention at the time. But I know in similar situations, it would be like increased heart rate, less perception in terms of being able to pay attention to other things around me.
So like a hyper focusedness?
Right.
Okay. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, when I was listening to that scenario or the case study, I could tell that I was feeling tense up and I was kind of hyper focused. Like I stopped whatever I was doing and I just really tuned in and listened to you explain what was happening. Like my shoulders were tensed up and I could feel like my breathing probably changed a little bit because like he was saying, that's a horrible situation for someone to go through. And then just imagining as a woman myself, just listening to what she went through, I was feeling scared like I was going through it myself just because I was trying to empathize with like both of us being women. So it was a lot.
Thank you too for sharing. Is there one more person that would be willing to share how they felt?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So for me, because I've encountered similar situations with clients, I tend to need to take a minute to kind of process what they told me before I can kind of get my own emotions under control before I can respond to them. Because that is really hard. And I deal with teenagers, and to hear it from teenagers when it seems to be a successive thing that happens with them, kind of almost like they have a beacon and these wrong people are seeing it. It's very traumatizing that no one protected them, and you feel like you want to protect them.
Yes.
For that. So it takes a minute to kind of get yourself together to respond to them in a professional way as to how they can handle their own feelings.
Yes. Thank you three for sharing what you felt. So if you wouldn't mind going back on mute, that way we can kind of continue. So the reason why I'm telling that story or that case study is because I'm sure everybody has heard of Brené Brown. I'm sure that people have seen her videos. I want to share this video with you with Brené Brown, and this explains, in my opinion, why our field, anybody working with people that are struggling with trauma, why there's so secondary trauma and burnout in our field that's so high. Because I think this video describes what we do naturally without even thinking about it. So it's like a 2-minute video, okay? And if you've seen it, then just go ahead and enjoy it again.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I'm down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversation is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
So, okay. So that video, everything that the three people, and I appreciate you for opening up and being willing to speak on how you felt. That is empathy. That is not sympathy. The last person, thank you so much for being so vulnerable and saying, look, that's happened to me. I can relate to that. And so what happens is when we go into this field, if we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't have the ability to have some level of differentiation, then we're going to get caught up in those stories, which it's difficult to have a level of differentiation. You know, I've had friends that say, well, you know, do you diagnose people, you know, when they come in and they have PTSD? You know, do you diagnose clinicians, you know, when they have, you know, traumas or, you know, vicarious trauma or secondary trauma? Secondary trauma is not in the DSM yet, but I'm sure it will be in the near future. And to me, I think what's important is to remember that we're dealing with a human, not that we're dealing with a cluster of symptoms. And I think understanding that and realizing that puts the clients that we're working with, their behavior into perspective. And it helps us lean into them and help them move through this, through their situation. So what is secondary trauma? Traumatic stress. It's an emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. Accordingly, individuals affected by secondary stress may find themselves re-experiencing personal trauma or increased in arousal and avoidance reactions related to the indirect trauma exposure. So why did I tell you the story and then move to burnout and then come back to the story? The reason is when I was telling you the story and you were feeling everything, you probably felt it pretty strong. And when we switched gears, maybe there was a decrease in emotion. Maybe there wasn't. Maybe there was some rumination going on. But when we came back to it and talked about it some more, and we focused on it, I would probably bet that the emotions that you felt when I was telling the story the first time, probably some of those came back and probably just as strong. And so we have to remember that those things that you felt, whether it's in your stomach or the hyperfocus, or you felt the tension in your shoulders, those are all things our body is telling you, hey, that's part of where those silent symptoms come in. Or you might say, well, I'm not acting out and I'm not drinking and everything's fine. But we really, really, really have to check ourselves and say, okay, what is going on in me that's causing some of my memory, right back to the cell phone, some of that memory that's getting taken up that I need to either process or I need to exercise or do my diet, whatever I need to do to be able to recharge myself. So here's what the statistics are saying. So therapists are 6% to about 26% at risk from having secondary traumatic stress. Child welfare workers are at high risk up to 50%. I was going to ask before I started the presentation to see who was working where. But if you think about it, 50%, that means that 1 out of every 2 CPS worker, paramedic that's dealing, with kids, high school counselor or middle school counselor, 1 of 2 are at risk from having secondary traumatic stress. And so the professionals working with traumatized children that are at higher risk, women are at higher risk, empathetic personality styles. And so that was the video that we just saw, was on empathy. And so I would say that the vast majority of people that come into this field are empathetic. People with unresolved trauma. So I often hear from clinicians, when I had interns that I was supervising, one of the stories that I would hear quite often was, well, I had a therapist in my life, and because the therapist changed my life, then now I want to change other people's lives, which is fantastic. That's great. But once I dug in and I said, okay, well, tell me about that. Like, what was different? What was so great about the therapist? And what was so great about how it changed your life? I started realizing that there was a vast majority of the interns that were actually still trying to resolve their own trauma through helping other kids. And so what was happening is, in their mind, so we know that our brain, likes to be in control. And so if we have this unresolved trauma in our brain and we're doing things that we're trying to help other kids, or we're in a helping field, then we feel like we're actually doing something about our own trauma, but we're really not. We're really running for our traumas. So people that have unresolved traumas really have to take the time to look at themselves and say, okay, am I, wanting to help all these kids or help these people because it's from a place of healthiness and get them to a better place? Or is it from a place of me continuing to run from my unresolved trauma? So workers with heavy caseloads, socially or organizationally isolated. And that's a big one. When you're socially or organizationally isolated, if you are in a place where your organization either doesn't provide you the support that you need or doesn't give you the outlet to feel safe, that increases your risk of STS. So people who feel undertrained, and that was one of the biggest things that I saw in the research, is people that feel undertrained or underprepared or don't have the experience are the highest ones that have, or not highest, but are in this bracket of having the social traumatic stress manifest in their lives. So here's another case study. This is Mike. He's a 28-year-old male, and I actually worked with this person. I don't work with him anymore, but I didn't realize what was going on. But this is when we worked with chronically suicidal and homicidal people. In hindsight, you look at it and, he was working 12-hour days on average. So there was some days that it was 14, some days that it was 16, Monday through Sunday. Working on call schedule 24/7, 365 a year, he was on call. Poor sleep, and poor sleep first started because of being on call. But then after some time, the poor sleep actually happened because he was fearful that something was going to happen to his client, or his client had mentioned something. And in the middle of the night, he's thinking, oh my gosh, what if this client killed himself? What if this is what's going on? And so then not sleeping and being on call and running nonstop created some feelings of hopelessness. Felt like what he was doing in that industry wasn't even making a difference. He had been recently married, so he had a difficult time connecting with the spouse. Part of it is because he was always on the job, but the other part is when he got home, he was completely emotionally fatigued, and anytime she wanted to connect with him, there was some level of irritability there. So I remember being in the office, and he would say that his heart was racing. The guy didn't drink coffee, didn't drink energy drinks, so it's like, okay, are you having an anxiety attack, or is it heart palpitations, or what's going on? Avoided meeting with clients, and that was something that really stood out to me. Was when he first started working, he loved the client connection, and he loved feeling like he was able to help them. So used to exercise, had been recently married, used to exercise, stopped exercising because he was chronically fatigued, and he felt guilty when he was at home. Felt irritable, difficulty with concentration and focus. And so this is an example of secondary traumatic stress. Somebody that this person was dealing with chronically suicidal, homicidal clients. So every call that he got, he went to de-escalate somebody that was actively suicidal, or he went to go talk to somebody that was actively homicidal. And so trying to decrease hospitalizations, you have to go in and meet with them, help them de-escalate. So hearing those stories, hearing stories about people wanting to die was very difficult. And so here's a graph to look at the difference between burnout and STS. So in burnout, it's the top, we already read that, but in the bottom, when we look at STS, there's hypervigilance, hopelessness, withdrawal, numbness, inability to listen, avoidance of clients, anger and cynicism, rigid thinking, right? So the rigid thinking is one where sometimes we as clinicians kind of get into the level of feeling like we have to save or we have to protect, which we do. But when it gets rigid to the point where we're hyper focused and we can't move away from it and we're stuck on it, that creates this emotional fatigue. Sleeplessness, fear, chronic exhaustion, preoccupation with trauma. And that's one that I think is very interesting, the preoccupation with trauma, because with Mike, it wasn't necessarily the specific case that he was ruminating on, but when something would happen in his personal life, when he was off of work, whether it was with his spouse or it was at a family gathering, if he heard something, he would then associate that with one of the trauma stories that he heard while he was at work. And so there was no differentiation. Everything was mixed for him. So physical ailments, minimizing, difficulty breathing, muscle and joint pain, inability to embrace complexity. And so the inability to embrace complexity, that's where there's like a level of just kind of giving up. You know, there's no grit because everything has been completely depleted. And so the ability to really struggle through the difficult part to get to the other side becomes very difficult. There's guilt and impaired immune system. And that's one of the other things that I did see with Mike is he was getting sick pretty much every 90 days. You knew there was a cold or there was a fever, there was something coming up, which was very strange to me. So secondary trauma prevention. So there's a three-pronged approach that that is shown is the most effective to either help prevent trauma or to help if there's already been some secondary trauma to help you not let it impact the rest of your life. So psychoeducation is one of them, right? So knowing kind of the theory and the background and what to do when is important. Skills training, so that's actually learning more tools for your tool belt. So psychoeducation is more the theory and book work. The skills training is learning different interventions so you don't feel hopeless or you don't feel helpless when you're in a situation that needs a different skill set or that needs a different intervention. And supervision. So I was talking to a friend the other day, and he does a lot of court work, and I asked him if I can share this story, and he said I could. And he has some pretty high profile cases with some people that are very influential. And so we're talking, and he says, you know, it's really difficult to do the right thing. He says, but everybody says it's so easy. Like you do the right thing and you're fine. And so as we're talking, you know, what came to mind is, you know, doing the right thing is not easy in the moment. Doing the right thing is easy in the long term. So in that moment, doing what's right, and what I mean by that in regards to secondary trauma is of taking care of yourself or doing the things that you have to do are what's going to help you long term in this field. And so having supervision, having somebody to talk to that can look from the outside looking in and give you different advice is very, very important. for your health. So here's some more secondary trauma prevention and treatment. So self-report assessments. So if you have a case that's particularly difficult, or you have a case that you're stuck on, one of the things that I see is a lot of therapists and a lot of caseworkers feel like they're an island. They feel like they're alone. And sometimes it's an institutional thing, but sometimes that's how they look at their situation. I'm alone. I need to fix it. It's my responsibility. And so there's no self-reporting assessment. There's nobody that they talk to be able to process that information. Participation in self-care groups. This is so important. And it doesn't have to be like a traditional Al-Anon group or a group like that. This could be just a group of clinicians that you can just talk to. The other thing that I think is important with this participation in a self-care group is it doesn't have to be people that you know. You can have like a board of trustees for your life that you look at and you say, I like what they're doing with their life, and I want my life to reflect some of that. And so the good thing about that is that if one of those people on your board of trustees goes haywire, you can fire them. They don't even know because you don't talk to them. But it gives you that roadmap. It gives you that accountability to be able to stay healthy for yourself. Caseload balancing, taking time off. Taking time off is one that is so important. We know that our brain needs to decompress, needs to relax, and needs to have some healing that happens. Because, I mean, if we look at secondary trauma and we look at post-traumatic stress disorder, secondary trauma didn't necessarily, or it didn't witness the events, but it witnessed and has been there for the person that has witnessed that. That's going to change your brain. Just like trauma changes the brain structure, so will secondary trauma. And so it's important for us to take the time off to be able to recharge and invest in ourselves. That goes in with the self-care and accountability buddy system. And this is important. Sometimes I think that we get some great ideas in our mind and we go, full charge. And then when other people hear what we're doing, they go, what? What were you thinking? And so having a good group of accountability people around you where you can say, hey, look, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? Do you think that this is a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Do you think I'm way out in left field? And having some of that gives you the support. It's like with kids, when they're shutting down and you go into their room and you say, hey, I noticed that you've been more quiet than normal. If you need anything, I'm here for you. Let me know. Leave that door open of communication. That's what happens when we have that accountability system. So when we're able to talk to somebody and they say, hey, I'm kind of noticing that, this is what you're leaning to, or I'm noticing that you're, frustrated or you're burnt out, or, there's like, it kind of sounds like this is traumatizing for you. Having the ability to talk about that and feel validated creates just this level of connection. Proper rest is important. Nutrition, exercise, and stress reduction activities, those four together are so important. One of the therapists here, her name's Emily Benning, she does a presentation on sleep. And if you haven't seen it, I would highly encourage you next time she's presenting for you guys to watch it or to see it. Because one of the things that she talks about is when, I think it's if you're sleeping like less than 6 hours per night or maybe less than 4 hours per night, then when you're driving, so when you're getting up to go to work, it's like you're impaired. It's like you're drunk. And so, I mean, just think about that. If you're not sleeping the hours that you're supposed to sleep, you are meeting with clients and your brain is as if it was drunk. And so that's something that's really important to think about. The proper rest is so important. So dynamic tension, and then we'll be finished. So dynamic tension is, I think we have to look at conflicts that happen in our lives. So there's intrapersonal, so that's, within me. There's interpersonal between you and me, personal and functional between me and my job, personal/organizational between me and my organization. And so when we look at intrapersonal within me, that's where we can look at there being some level of STS, right? So we're looking at stress trauma that's potentially happening because that's something that's going on within you. But it could also be interpersonal between you and me. And so if you have a friend or you have somebody that you talk to and they just don't give you the support that you need or the connection that you need, that could create some stress. Or if you're always going in and saving them from their drama or saving them from their situation, then that's putting a lot of stress on you. So between me and my job, typically that doesn't necessarily have to do with your actual job, but with what's expected of you. And so oftentimes you hear people say, well, I stayed because of my coworkers, or I stayed there because I couldn't let my coworkers down. You know, that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself in that situation, and that could increase the potential for STS. So personal, organizational, so between me and my organization, and that's where we look at, you know, when you are in a company or in a job that goes against your moral compass. And so in the situations that you're in, if you have to make a decision that goes against your moral compass, that's going to really tear down the ability for you to function. And so things like that over time are going to increase the traumatic stress, secondary traumatic stress that could happen in your life, because every time you see or do something that goes against your moral compass, it's going to create this inner conflict within yourself. And so the dynamic tension, what we're looking at is, so it's any system of psychology that emphasizes the interaction between different motives, emotions, and drives. And so basically, it's looking at two things that are conflicting in the same space, but independent of each other. And so when we're not able to do that, so when we look at, you know, for example, if we look at CPS and we say, oh, well, you know, the system is broken. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, well, the whole thing is broken. So we can't have two opposing thoughts. We can't say, well, you know, they do some good for some people, and sometimes, you know, maybe they drop the ball because they're human, like all of us are, right? We look at a psychiatric hospital and we say, well, you know, that hospital is horrible. Well, you know, some of those hospitals have helped some people and some of them haven't. And here's the thing, that's where you have that dynamic tension. So you have the ability within that tension to make the choice that you feel is the most appropriate for you and for the situation. And ultimately, making those choices, aligning with your moral compass, are going to decrease secondary traumatic stress in your life. And it's okay to trust your gut and do what you feel is best for you. So that is the end of my presentation. I know I went a little bit over on time. GD, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if there's still people, if they want to open it up for questions. I have time to do some questions if somebody has some questions.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions? You can unmute yourself.
I have a question.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, I have a friend who is a social worker, and she works with people who've experienced domestic violence. And just talking to her sometimes, it's like I can tell that she's probably starting to feel burnout or the secondary trauma just from listening to their stories all the time, or getting those crisis calls in the middle of the night or something like that. Just listening to her, I can tell that she's stressed and she kind of needs a break. So how would you go about telling someone like, hey, I think you're experiencing burnout or something? Because just by saying it, it's like, oh, no, it's okay. That's my job. That's just what I do. But I'm like, no, you really need to take a break.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great question. And it's kind of tough, right, from like clinician to clinician, because I think a lot of us have our, you know, superwoman, you know, cape under, Superman cape under our clothes. And so we kind of feel like, well, no, I have to do this. And so I think it's understanding that there's a balance between truth and love. And so sometimes it's about setting the tone, and it's saying, hey, you know what? I want to talk to you about something, but when I brought it up in the past or when I've mentioned it, you know, it's been minimized, and I really want to take the time for you to know that this is something that concerns me, and because I love you, I want to tell you what I'm seeing. And a part of it is probably talking about specific behavior and saying, hey, I notice that when you're talking about a client or when you're talking about work, you know, you start, your heart starts racing, or, you know, like I could see you breathing heavy, you know, I can see you get tense, you know, I can see it in your eyes that, you know, you're not here with me anymore. Now you're in those stories that you're telling me about. But it's really a balance of truth and love.
Thank you for your question. That's a good answer.
I hope that helps.
Anyone else?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm actually not a counselor. I'm a prospective adoptive parent of foster children. I can see how so much of this applies to adoptive parents as well. And of course, we're encouraged to reach out for help at, you know, along the way so that we don't get burnout. But is there anything that we need to keep in mind to, I don't know, I guess when you're in the moment and it's new and it's overwhelming, it's hard to recognize what's burned out, you know, or what's the line where you say, okay, I've got to get some help versus it's just really intense right now and we knew it was going to be intense. Is it just finding that balance of having people to back you up and step away for a little bit so you can evaluate your own self to take care of your children that have now been placed in your care? Or is it something that we should be thinking about, like, I need to like set some time regularly to go talk to someone and make sure that I'm okay?
Wow. I can't even imagine the situation that you're in. Thank you so much for opening up. I know that part of what is happening is some of these, you're inheriting some of the trauma from the past, from the child or children. And I know that there's a level of you're saying, well, you know, we have to have some boundaries and, you know, they have to have some respect, but at the same time, you know, we want to be loving and caring and help them know that this is a safe environment. And so one of the things that I would really encourage you to do is remind yourself that first and foremost, you need to be their parent. I'd be cautious about stepping into being their counselor because they need a parent. They need to know that without a doubt, they are loved. So we got to connect to the heart first before we connect to the mind. Because in my history, whenever I have dealt with somebody that has a substance abuse issue when they're older, I've never met somebody that doesn't have a hurt from the heart. I'm not saying that your child is going to be a substance abuser. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to make the connection that if you can connect with their heart and really look at what they're saying through their behavior, then you'll be able to connect with them easier. That's the first thing. The second thing is I hear a lot of responsibility and pressure on yourself. I could hear it in your voice. So I want you to take a deep breath and remind yourself that you are doing the best that you can with what you got.
Right. And to be clear, I haven't adopted yet. I'm just trying to anticipate because I know that I can be very empathetic and I have to watch that. When you were talking earlier with the first case study, I started imagining it myself and I have to cut myself off from that kind of thing. So that's what I'm trying to anticipate. If they open up to me and tell me their stories, how do I know when, okay, not only just finding them help to deal with it, but also finding that line where I'm taking care of myself, but I don't want to step away from them too much. I want to, you know, have that connection at the same time. So yeah. I want to take care of myself so I can take care of them.
Yes, perfect. Well, and it sounds like I said, even in your voice, so it still sounds like there's a lot of responsibility, like there's a lot of, I wouldn't say pressure, but it sounds like you're taking a lot of responsibility in the situation with your future adopted child. I think being prepared, so having people around you that have been through it would be very important. but also remembering that every kid is different. And so, I always kind of laugh when parents say, hey, can you give me a good book, to help my child? And I'm like, well, sure, but every book that I give you, it's not going to be your child. So it's great theory. It's great to look at, but until you're in it, that's when you're really, really going to see what you can do. So yes, having a group of people that have been through it and kind of talking with them is very important. Understanding that you're doing the best that you can with what you got in that situation. And here's the thing, when you can do that, then you know that you need new energy, and that you need new knowledge, and that you need new support if you're doing everything that you can with what you got. And that should be kind of that compass for you to go, okay, so I don't have anything more. I need some support for me to be able to move forward with my son or daughter.
Yeah. And I think along with that, kind of going back to what Jorge said earlier, I mean, this applies, it applies to a position if you're employed. It also, applies to parenting. So, taking time off, like understanding like who's going to provide respite for me whenever things kind of get a little too intense and I just need a breather. That could be a family member, it could be a respite, service, whatever that looks like. And then also having your support. So again, we want to kind of be mindful of who we're sharing our children's stories with. And so if that looks like you have an individual counselor and it's just like, hey, I just need to come and like word vomit for you for a little bit, because I know that this is confidential and, it's not going to be somebody in my child's life that's now going to look at them differently. So having that support and then also having that respite too, I think would be important.
That's a really good point, having someone you can feel confident to talk to and it doesn't change the outlook of the child in the process. Yeah.
Right.
Thank you. That's good advice too.
Yeah. Any other questions that you guys might have? I think this is such a it is just such a topic that can be applied to so many situations, whether that's your personal life, your professional life, today's world, especially with what's going on. And so I know a lot of people are kind of at their, boiling point, and there are people that are responding in ways that they're not really quite sure why they're responding that way. And so being able to kind of take a breath and take a step back and say, is this something that I'm struggling with? Are there some, some of these silent symptoms that now I'm starting to recognize in myself, and do I need to reach out for help, either to a family member or to a therapist? There's no shame in reaching out for help at all. And that again will make you a better worker. It'll make you a better parent, a better spouse, a better sibling, all of those things. So thank you, Jorge, so much for all that you shared with us. This is fascinating information. I'm so glad that you were able to kind of take us through some of this stuff and take a breath.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, if there's no other questions, we will go ahead and end it. Like I said, there should be a pop-up of the CEU whenever we end the webinar. If that doesn't happen for you, don't fret. There will be an email that will go out to the email that you registered with that link and a copy of the recording. If you love this webinar, like I hope that you did, feel free to leave a Google review for Gladney University. And actually, Jorge did an episode of our Reframed podcast on this topic earlier. And so that will be out soon if you want to kind of dive deeper into some of the things that we talked about today. So thank you guys very much. Thanks, Jorge.
Thank you, Jimmy. Bye. You guys have a good day.